Hi, I'm Aaron Marcus, and welcome to today's webinar. This is all about secrets to memorizing your lines, and this is going to be a really, really interesting one. Um, there are so many different techniques that people use, and one of the things that I found that was really interesting about trying to figure out what to present to you is that everybody learns differently. It's kind of like any other kind of skill. And there are certain things that work really well for certain people and some things that don't work well for others. So what I'm going to be doing is sharing with you many different techniques and strategies that people use. And if you're like me, you kind of pick and choose some things that are that work well for you, and other things you kind of just let it go. You might want to try it and see what works best for you. So let's get going here. And just to let you know also, at the very end of the workshop, I am going to be going over all the questions that were sent in to me ahead of time. Okay, so let's say you are in a very fortunate situation and either your agent or you got a hold of some sides, which is the short portion of the script, and that would be for either a TV show or maybe an industrial film or a movie, a feature film, an independent film, or maybe you got the copy. And the copy typically are the words for a TV commercial. Could be for a radio commercial, but you don't have to worry about memorizing anything for radio spots, which is great. So you just got these things in your hands, and you've got to start memorizing them. So here are a couple steps that I highly recommend that you take before you even begin to memorize anything. Very first thing is, you want to make sure you're in a relaxed kind of atmosphere. But memorizing words, it takes time. Memorizing lines, it takes time. Look, there are some people I know who they're really almost like photographic memories, and I've seen people do it. It's pretty incredible. They can actually look at a page of material, just kind of like look down, boom, they got it, and then they can repeat it. Look, there are people that can do that. I can't. Most people in this world can't, but there are some people that can. So if you're like me, it takes you a little bit of time. So the most important thing is make sure that you're in a comfortable place. If there's a lot going on in the room, things are hectic, things are loud, there's a lot of busyness happening. For me, that's a very tough way to try to memorize lines. So I find a place that's calm, relaxing, and I just really take my time with this. The other thing is you want to be comfortable. Find a nice sofa, a nice chair, if you like sitting on the floor, whatever is good for you. Just make sure you're comfortable doing this process. And like I was saying, it's got to be a quiet place. And once again, look, here I'm saying this, but everybody's different. I know people that can study in college and stuff. They were studying for exams with music playing. I can't. If there's music going on in the background, I'm listening to the music and I can't really concentrate. And so that's something that's also really helpful for you to experiment with and learn. Maybe having music in the background is great. Maybe it does exactly what it's supposed to do for you and it helps you to really focus in. For me, it's just the opposite. I need to be hearing absolutely nothing. And the other thing is, and once again, this is a very personalized kind of thing. Everybody works better at different times during the day. There are some people that do great work at night. There are some people who do great work in the afternoon. Some people who do really good work early in the morning. For me, I'm a morning person. So I like getting started with memorizing things earlier in the day. I'm not really all that good at doing things very late at night. So these are some really important things to think about, to experiment with, test out, and then see what works best for you. So you've got the sides or the copy in your hand. Now, don't make the mistake of what some actors do, and I've heard of people doing this. I've seen some people do this, and it's just not a good way to develop good acting skills. And what they do is they will just highlight their lines and just look at their lines. And they kind of go through it and they just start memorizing their lines. And I could probably do an entire workshop on why that is not a good technique to use. So let me just say, don't do that. I mean, you can highlight your lines. I mean, that's fine. But what you need to do is read everything on the page. All the information that you see on the page, you need to read it. Now, it's not to say that you always have to take all of the notes that the writers have given you and utilize that. Sometimes you might find there's a question mark at the end of a sentence. Well, maybe depending on your interpretation and your character and where the character is going, it might not be said as a question. So still, you've got to make decisions about this, but still read it. And then at least it gives you more material to make decisions with. And here's the other thing, and this is where a lot of actors make a huge mistake. They get the sides, they start reading it, and they're reading everything, but they're starting to act it out, and they're starting to add some, personal things in there. They're starting to try to make it powerful because it's just taking them to a place. Don't do that at all. Not when you're first getting started here. What you want to do is read it in a really plain, bland way. It's kind of like you're reading the, Yellow Pages. You're reading a grocery list. And so the way that I would actually read it, if my line is, the bottom line here is, this is how I would say it. Read the lines like a grocery list. No inflection, not as an actor. That's how you need to start doing it. And let me tell you why. For people who start trying to add some emotions to the lines, you will start getting locked in to reading it a certain way. And what can happen is you go to the audition, or maybe you're even on the set at that point because you've already booked it, and the director asks you to do it differently. And it's going to be really tough. You have to start unlearning things. And in some ways, it's very similar. Most of you would know this, but when I was in college, I actually studied classical guitar. Studied guitar in college. And I had a teacher who used a very specific method, and it's very similar to what I'm teaching you here. And that's why I find it really interesting, and this is why it makes sense for me. Before I would actually be allowed to start playing a new piece of music, I would have to see it in my head and say it in my head, or actually I'd say it out loud. But what I would do is I would say all the fingerings for all the notes that had to be played. So, it might be my first finger is on the second fret, on the third string, and I would go through the entire piece this way. And the whole idea was not to build in mistakes, because you start going through a new piece of music, you make mistakes, and then what happens? It's hard to break that. And every time you get to that point in the music, you're getting nervous, you're thinking, uh-oh, this is where I always goof up. So if you can see it, hear it in your head first, and you play it very slowly, you start playing it without mistakes. I'm not saying, look, we're human, we make mistakes, but you really cut down on the errors that you make. And the same thing here, you don't want to get locked into doing things in a very specific way, because then it makes it hard to change, and you're not ready to start adding any kind of acting information into your lines yet. You want to get your lines memorized first. So some of the other things that I've seen actors do that is not a good idea, they just read the words, and if there's something they're not sure, they'll kind of guess at it. Look, here's what you need to do. You've got to make sure that you understand all the words. Now, there are times where you will actually show up to a casting, and that might be the very first time that you get the sides or the copy in your hand. In which case, there are some questions that you need to ask the casting director if you're not sure about some things. One of them is, if there's a word you don't understand. Now, I get it. it's a little uncomfortable to say to a casting director, hey, could you tell me exactly what this word means? Because, then we feel kind of silly because we don't seem intelligent. But let me tell you, you are much, much, much better off making sure you understand the meaning of a word than to use it incorrectly, because then it's going to sound really bad. The other thing, too, is you want to make sure you know how to pronounce all the words. And I've done this many times, especially if it's some kind of project where, I'm a doctor, and I might not be 100% sure how to pronounce a certain word. And even if I'm not, really sure, I'm going to ask. If I think, well, I think I know how to say it. Always ask. And that also holds true with names. There might be a character. Now, if it's a TV show, you should have already watched the show. You should know, who all the people are. But it could be a new character on the show that hasn't appeared yet, and you're not 100% sure. Always ask the casting director, is this how you pronounce the person's name? And the same thing holds true if there's something that has an acronym in it. I'm just making this up. So let's say, you're going into audition, and you're not sure, when you're memorizing this stuff, should you have been memorizing USPS, or do they want you to say it United States Postal Service? So those are some other things that I always ask. If you don't get the sides, until you show up, you're going to have to ask the casting director there. Otherwise, see if you can find out ahead of time, or just understand. Make a little note to ask that when you do go in to read, how do they want you to say it, just so that you are pronouncing everything correctly. Okay, so there are a number of different techniques that I'm going to be sharing with you. So you've read through the material, a bunch of times. You've read everything. You've seen all the little notes that are in the sides or the copy. Here is one technique that I find helpful. And what you're going to be doing is write out all of your lines in one big paragraph. And you can say the lines as you're writing them down. Now, at first you're going to be having to look at the script, and then you're going to write it. And there's something, like I'm sure there is some, medical reasoning as to why this is a very helpful tool to use. But I know that it is, at least for me, it is. I find that when I look and I handwrite, and it's different to actually handwrite it as opposed to just typing it on a laptop. I'm not sure exactly why that is, but I find it much, much more helpful just to have a big piece of paper and actually handwrite it, and I take my time with it to make sure that I can actually read the words. And in some ways, it just seems like it's imprinting those words into my brain as I'm saying it. And I'm going to do this 4 or 5 times. And by the time that I am going to keep going through it, and then what you'll find is that you want to start taking a break at the end of one line, and then you know that somebody else is talking to you. There's another person that you're having this interaction with. So leave a little pause there, and then start trying to say your next line. And what you're going to find is when you do this over and over and over again, that all of a sudden, you're going to start being able to say the lines without looking at the script that much. And once again, even if this is a good method for you, it might not be the only method that you use. There might be a combination of things that you do. But I would definitely try playing around with this. I find it really helpful. Okay, so let me move on to the next one. This one's also an interesting technique. So you've got, the words in front of you, you've got the copy in front of you. And what you're going to do is put your hand over the last few letters of the last word of each line. And then what you'll do is you're going to start reading, reading the words, and see if you can get the very last word. part of the letters are being covered up with your right hand. And then what you're going to do is go back, say it again, but now have the entire last word covered up. And see if you can get that last word. And then you do it again, and then you'll cover up, the last word plus a couple of the last letters of the next to the last word. And you just keep going through that, and then you'll eventually cover up, both the words, and you'll do the same thing, and you're kind of working backwards here. And you can do this throughout the entire script. And, once again, I wouldn't necessarily do any kind of acting with this. I find it's kind of tough to really add the emotional content into things until I'm really very familiar. I'm not saying I have to be 100% off book, but I've got to be pretty familiar with the words in order for me to, really be able to utilize these techniques. And then later, I start adding in the components of the character and how I want to, how I want to read the lines. Here is another way of memorizing things. What you can do is you just take an index card, and what you're going to do, this also involves writing. And on one side of the card, you're going to write down the cue lines, the lines that are being said prior to your line. And then on the flip side, on the back side of that index card, what you're going to do is write your lines. And then what you're going to do is practice. You look at the index card, you see the cue line, and see if you can say your line. And if not, then you flip it over, look at it, and just keep repeating it, over and over and over again. And one of the other tricks, and this holds true for any time you're memorizing any kind of dialogue, is at least for me, don't stay in the same spot all the time. I find it really helpful to move around, because it's a funny thing, and once again, I don't really understand this from a brain, from a neurological point of view, but if I do all of my lines in the same chair, in the same room, I could walk into another room, and all of a sudden I start feeling I get stuck. So, certainly I do find a place that I spend most of my time doing my work, but once I feel like I'm starting to memorize things and things are going well, I like to shift around a little bit and start getting comfortable in different environments. So sometimes I'll move into another room, sometimes I'll go downstairs in my house, sometimes I like to go outside, and I even find that when I'm in my trailer, I might be going over lines there, but I actually want to go over my lines at least a couple of times on the set itself, on where I'm going to be. I just find that it's a very different atmosphere. It hits me in a different way, and so I think it's really important not to get locked into only doing your lines in one specific place. And also, don't forget, stand. Walk around. Sometimes, I can be doing my lines and maybe I'm making a meal and I'm just starting to do my lines. And I find that just being in different environments and doing other things can be really helpful, and especially if you're doing other tasks, because that way that those lines are secure. Because you are concentrating, cutting up a carrot or whatever you're doing, and you're still able to do your lines. So anyhow, mix things up, add in some activities, while you're doing your lines, and you're going to find that's going to be really helpful to you. Now, there might be times where you're working on something and you just get stuck. That happens to everybody. And something that will be really, really good for you is to try to connect certain images with very specific keywords in a sentence. So, like for instance, let's say if your line is to be or not to be. Well, something that you can do is on a piece of paper, you're going to actually place two images of bees. And so you'll look at it, and you're going to see, two B's, and then you're going to write down the remainder of the sentence. And it's, once again, from a neurological point of view, I don't understand it, but those things are really helpful, especially for people who are very visual. You will find that just adding images will really help you tremendously. Okay, so here is another technique that you can use. Read the entire sides, or the script, and then you're going to memorize one sentence at a time. After that line, that one sentence is memorized, say it, and then start memorizing the second sentence. So, in other words, instead of trying to, read through everything and say everything at once, separate them and go line by line. Get that first one down, and then once that feels really comfortable to you, move on to the second one. And then, what you're going to do is you can just continue going through. And if you want, you can even start at the beginning again, and get that first line, then you've got your second line. And, then you just keep going throughout the entire script. Repetition can be really helpful, but you also have to be thinking while you're doing it. Just doing things by rote, it makes it tough to be able to recall it if there's nothing really connecting it. So you also still want to be thinking about cue lines, who you're talking to, what's going on here. So here is another technique that you can use. Record your lines, and you can do this, and there are a couple different ways of doing this, either into your cell phone. You can do this in a laptop. There are free programs that you can use, and actually in one of the bonuses that you're going to get, and I wrote it down, there's something called the Rehearsal app, and I think it costs around $20, and that's also is a really good tool to use for memorizing lines. But for right now, let me just tell you about the recording things into a cell phone or a laptop. So what you want to do is you can do this a couple of different ways. You can either hear the other person's lines in your head or softly say them to yourself, and then say your next line. And then what you're going to do is you're going to play the lines back, you're going to listen to them, and then you begin saying the lines as you are, as you're listening to the recording. Now, there's another way, which is kind of the opposite, and you can try this one out as well, where you record the other actor's lines in a nice loud voice, and then you barely whisper your lines. And then you start playing it back, and you hear the cue lines, and then on top of the little whisper of your lines, you start to say them. And that's another technique that people use that also is really very helpful. And so, once again, this kind of goes back to what I was saying at the very beginning. There are some people who can hear things and really utilize that for memorization. There are other people that are more visual. They like to see things. They like to, it's more tactile, like to write things out. And so you want to figure out what's best for you, or maybe, do a combination. But the nice thing is you can test out all these different ideas and figure out which way will get you your lines memorized. Now, I've done this a few times, and I'll tell you when I've done this. When I've kind of hit a stumbling block. Maybe there's a certain word, and it doesn't have to be a complicated word. Sometimes there are just certain words that are written in a way that just don't feel right to me. Like I wouldn't say it like that. It feels like the wording is backwards or something, and I keep going back to an incorrect way of saying it. And look, every set is different. Every script supervisor is going to be different. Every director is different. Sometimes if you're in the ballpark and you're saying what they want you to say, content-wise, they're going to let it go. Some people are real sticklers. I remember once doing a TV show, and it was based on transcripts from a trial. And I could not miss, a word like end or everything had to be done exactly as it was written. So, everybody's going to do things differently. So if you do find yourself just kind of getting stuck a little bit, try singing your lines. I know it sounds a little bit silly, but, if you think about it, there are so many songs that you could sing right now. There are so many songs that have lots of words in them that you can conjure up and you can just start singing it. And you didn't have to really practice. You weren't, all that aware of saying, hey, I want to memorize this song. You would just hear it. You hear it a lot. You hear the melody, and you just keep singing it, and boom, all of a sudden, it's working for you. So when I get stuck, I'll start singing the lines. And the tune doesn't matter. Don't even worry about the tune. Just kind of make something up. And I don't know, I find this, and not like I don't use this for most scripts that I work on, but I tell you, when I have gotten a little bit stuck, singing has always pulled me through. So keep that one in mind too. Okay, so here is another thing that you might want to try. I've never done this. I did speak with somebody who did. They found it helpful. I'm not so sure about it, but once again, I want to share it with you, and then you can let me know whether you find this helpful also. So record your lines, and as you're getting ready to fall asleep, you start playing it. And some people feel that all of a sudden your brain will start hearing those words in your subconscious, and it helps you memorize things. So anyhow, I just wanted to share another technique with you, and hopefully this one will work for you. Like I said, I've never tried it because honestly, I think it would keep me up. And normally when I'm trying to go to sleep at night, I'm trying to forget about anything that has to do with work. Although I do have to tell you, if I have a shoot the next day, I probably, and I once again, maybe this is just how my brain works, I probably will go over my lines once, maybe twice, right before I go to sleep. I might be lying in bed, I'm going through the lines, and then I have to actually tell myself, stop. I got it, it went well, and if I forgot something, I'll go through it until I get it right, and then I go to sleep. And once again, on a little bit of a side note, and I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but I know that there have been times in my past where right before I'm doing a scene, I almost had this feeling of I'm taking a final exam. And I'm opening up my textbook, I'm looking at my notes, and I'm just like flying through them, as quickly as I possibly can. And I start going through my lines right before the scene. I'm going over and over and over and over. And what I found was that made it so difficult for me. What I find best is got my lines, I'm comfortable with them, I know that I've memorized them, I worked really hard at it, and then before the scene begins, as that little voice starts kicking in and wanting to cram, for the final that's about to happen, I have to actually tell myself, stop. I've got it. I'm okay with this. Just relax. And, if you've done your work, you're ready to do it, I find that trying to cram that stuff in at the last second, it's damaging. It's really tough. And what you can always do is if you're on a set, you've got the sides in your back pocket, and if you need to look at it one time, let's say after a rehearsal or even in a rehearsal, you can still have it in your hand, and if you need to glance at it, you can. For some people, it's like a little safety safety line or a little blanket for them that helps relax them, just knowing it's there, just in case they need it. But it's really interesting. Most of the well-known actors that either I've watched or I've had scenes with, these people, I mean, they're off doing other things. They're reading books, they're talking with people, they're doing other things, and then they go and they, do these huge pieces of material. It's pretty impressive to watch. They certainly are not sitting there cramming, things. So trust yourself. Okay, let me move on to another way. So this is something that I find most helpful, especially with industrial films, and just to make sure that you know what those are. There are things called, there are three names: industrial films, corporate, or educational films. And they're training films, and they can vary. They can be anything from information on how to build a diesel engine, in which case you might have a lot of really technical information, and you're talking about parts and engines, or it could be if you go to a big box store and you see somebody showing you how to fix something with a special tool, and there's a little monitor. That is a training film. Now there are different types. One is for the general public to see. Some are only specifically for companies or associations or government agencies. I mean, I've done hundreds of these things, and it could be anything from the United States Navy to it could be some association for school board members. And so anyhow, they really vary. And what you'll find is sometimes they can be very technical and pretty long. Now, if you are lucky enough to be the on-camera narrator or spokesperson, then you've got a teleprompter. So you've got to be familiar with your lines, but they're not memorized. And you can just sit there and read off a teleprompter, which is great. But if you are one of the actors in the scene, you're expected to memorize things. And it can be long. There can be a lot of material, and some of it can be tough. So here's what I like to do. I like to plan things out. And like I said earlier, I don't memorize things quickly. There are some people that memorize things very fast. I don't. So I always like to plan things out very methodically if I have a lot of lines to work on. So after highlighting my lines, and certainly I've read the script many times, here's what I do. And this might be crazy, but it works for me, and I want to share it with you. What I do is I will count all of my lines in the script. Now, the way that I do it is I don't do like a full sentence. If there's a line and it goes to the next line, even though it's still part of one sentence, I consider those two different lines. As long as it goes across the page, whether there's a period at the end or not, doesn't matter. That's one line for me. And what I do is I'm going to go through and count up every line in that script. So I'm just going to make up a number. Let's say there are 20 lines that I have. And once again, it will vary from every project to every industrial film. Then what I do is I count up how many days do I have to memorize everything before the actual shoot. So let's say there are 10 days that I have. So I've got 20 lines and 10 days. So normally that would be, I would need to memorize 2 lines a day to make it, to memorize all 20 lines in 10 days. Wait a minute, is that math right? Let's see. If I got 10 days, 20 lines, so I do 2 a day. Yeah, okay. My math is right on that one. And so what I also do is I never count it out to the very last day, to the shoot day, for a couple of reasons. One is shoot dates can change. And here I'm banking, memorizing 2 lines a day, and I'm going to end, and early in the morning I'm going to memorize those last 2 lines. Well, I would never do that. I always give myself a minimum of 3 days ahead of time before the actual shoot date. And I do that, like I was saying, partially because shoot date might change. Maybe they need, bring me in a day early. Or maybe I just have something going on one day and I simply can't sit down and memorize lines that day. So I like to give myself a little bit of a cushion. So I always like to have my lines memorized no later than at least 3 days prior to the shoot date. That just gives me a little bit more flexibility in case either I'm struggling one day, I don't have time one day. Then what I do is I memorize, the amount of days that I have by the lines that I have to memorize. So here's the specific example. If I have 8 lines, each day, what I do is this. So very first day, I'm going to memorize 8 lines. Then in day 2, I start with the first 8 lines again. And I'll go through them. It's going to take some time because I just learned them yesterday. I'm going to be kind of rusty, but certainly it's going to go a lot faster than the day before. Once I finish those 8 lines, then I go to my next 8 lines. And I get really comfortable with those 8 lines. And then in day 3, I start from the very, very beginning again. And I'm going to do my first 8 lines from the first day, second 8 lines from the second day, third 8 lines from the next day. And that's how I do it. And I'll keep going through that. And I will finish 3 days, at least, minimum of 3 days prior to the shoot date. And what you're going to find is that as you start working on those last 8, 16 lines, before you're completed all the memorization, you're going to be spending a long time. The first day is pretty easy. You spent a little bit of time doing 8 lines. Next day is still pretty easy. You had 16 lines. But by the end, you're going through everything to get to those last 8 lines. So, just prepare yourself. And look, it takes time. And that's why, for these industrial films, sometimes they can be tough. I find them to be very challenging sometimes. Sometimes the information doesn't necessarily really intrigue me that much, but it's a great technical exercise, and that's something that I find really challenging and interesting, just as a way of memorizing things that I might not fully understand. If I'm talking about really technical things, fiber optic cables, and stuff like that. So I do my best trying to understand everything I possibly can, but sometimes there's just some scientific information that's just beyond my pay scale, and I do the best I can, but I always make sure that it sounds like it's just rolling off my tongue in a really comfortable and conversational way. Okay. So this just kind of finishes up this idea. So you're going to keep doing this until you finish the script, and you're going to find that each day it's going to get longer and longer and longer. Now here's another, and this is the very last one, and I'm going to go to questions because I had a bunch of questions that I want to go answer for people. After you're pretty comfortable, with memorizing your lines, you need to have a reader. You need to have somebody read the lines with you. Now, some people will say it has to be another actor. And I don't know. For me, it doesn't have to be. I can just read with anybody as long as they can read lines back. Doesn't have to be with any kind of emotion. And in some ways, I find it easier to have somebody respond to my lines and for me to respond to their lines with really very little emotion. And the reason for that, and there are a couple of reasons. One is the other person won't start taking me into a direction that I might not want to go into with my character. If they're just reading their lines pretty flat, I mean they're fluent, but they're kind of flat, then I could really stay on course with how I want my character to present himself. The other thing too is when somebody is just reading things back flat, it gives you more of a surprise when you're doing it on the set with another actor. Because if you are constantly hearing your lines being read, the opposite lines being read back to you with a lot of emotion, by the time you're on the set, you've heard this and felt it so many times, unless you can shut yourself off when you've been rehearsing it with, somebody else. So, look, some people say always have another actor to read your lines, with. I just don't find it really necessary. And like I said, in some ways, I find it a little bit easier not to have another actor. So that way, when I do walk onto the set and I'm doing their lines and I'm listening and I'm watching and I'm reacting to the other actor, it feels so much more like the first time for me, as opposed to having had rehearse it with another actor possibly taking that character in a very different direction as well. And the other thing is you just want to make sure that you get very comfortable with the cue lines. And so once again, it doesn't take another actor to do that. You just need somebody who can read. So those were the techniques that I wanted to share with you. And I just wanted to mention that sometimes, memorizing lines can be tough, especially when you don't do it on a regular basis. For people who go from movie to movie to movie, who are in, TV shows, and every day, they're pretty much learning lines. It's like, any other kind of muscle. I mean, you build it up and it stays flexible and it works really well. And, unfortunately for most actors, there are long stretches where you might not be having to memorize anything. And then all of a sudden you get hit with stuff and you got to memorize a lot, and it can be really tough. So the key thing to remember is, no matter what anybody tells you, there is no one right way to memorize your lines. Every person is different. Everybody's brain works differently. Everybody has, different strengths and weaknesses, and pick and choose. It's like taking, acting classes and studying different styles and different methods. There is no one right way of doing any of this stuff. You do what is right for you and what feels right to you, and ultimately it doesn't matter how you get there. It's the fact that you do get there. Whether it's a visual thing, whether it's auditory, it doesn't make any difference. So what I would suggest that you do is test a number of ways of doing it. And if you don't have a script and you're thinking, well, I don't have anything to audition with, don't worry whether it's a script or not. What you want to do is just memorize. So, open up a newspaper, grab a magazine article, and start memorizing it. Treat it as if it were a script. Now, you're not going to have, lines opposite yours, but that's okay. Really, that's fine. What you want to do is work on keeping your brain ready and sharp so that you can memorize lines when it does come up for you. So keep doing that on a regular basis, and you're going to find that this will be incredibly helpful to you when you do have to memorize things for your next audition or for your next job. Okay, so what I want to do now is I'm going to start going through, like I said, there were a bunch of questions that came in, and let me start answering some of those for people. And like I do for all of my workshops, I'm never going to give out people's full names, just so that way you can feel really comfortable in asking anything that you want to ask, and you'll never be identified. And so anyhow, I think when people do this anonymously, it makes it much, much, much better. So this came in from Dale, and the question is, do you recommend that I memorize my lines for an audition? That is a great question. And kind of like with everything that I talk about, there is no one right answer. And I'm going to give you a couple of different answers, and I'll tell you what I do, and then you make a decision for yourself. So I remember talking with a manager of children in Los Angeles, and she said that if she has the copy or the sides for her clients, for the actors, at least a day ahead of time, she expects all of her talent to have things memorized for the audition. She said it's going to look better, you're going to sound better, you're going to be more professional if you walk in there without any sides in your hand and you've got everything memorized. Okay, that's one way of doing things. Spoke to a manager on the East Coast in New York, asked him the same question, and he said, I tell all of my talent to never memorize your lines for an audition. And I asked him why, and he said, look, I want them to be extremely familiar with it. They can try to memorize things, but I want them to use the sides while they're auditioning. I'm not, you're not going to sit there and just stare at the sides. You'll do the audition and then occasionally you'll glance down and grab a word. His reasoning is if you go in there and everything is memorized, people are going to think this is the best you can do. It's all memorized. You've already worked everything out. You're off book. However, if you give a great audition, it's powerful. And you're occasionally looking at the sides. Once again, you're really comfortable with it. It's not like you're sitting there staring at it. People are going to think, wow, that was a great audition. And he's not even finished with it yet. Imagine what it's going to be like when he actually has everything memorized. So, I like that idea much more. And so unless I am told very specifically by the agent, your lines have to be memorized for the audition, which is rare. It does happen sometimes. And I can tell you there have been a few TV shows where they don't give out, and this is also very uncommon, where they did not give out the sides ahead of time, and you didn't even see the sides until you showed up for the read. In which case, I would get there at least an hour early before I'm supposed to, and then I would start memorizing. Typically, I use the New York manager's advice. I'm very familiar, with all the words. I might be pretty much off book, but occasionally I'm going to need to glance over and grab it, and that's the way that I like to do it. Now, on a little bit of a separate note, if it's a TV commercial that you are auditioning for, if you can't memorize the lines, what you want to do is this. Always memorize the first line of the commercial and the last line of the commercial. Those you definitely want to read directly right into the camera. You don't want to be looking off to the side because those are really powerful parts. Those are like bookends for the commercial. So if memorizing the rest of it is a little tough, always memorize the first line, last line of a TV commercial. But otherwise, I typically don't memorize my lines for any audition, even if I'm doing an audition from home. Unless for some reason I can, and things just flow really well. Yeah, I mean, I will if I can, but I don't feel like I have to. And anyhow, so that's what I would suggest to you, Dale. Okay, this is from Jeffrey. Would you ever use an ear prompter when the dialogue was difficult? Okay, so let me just explain a little bit here what an ear prompter is, what you use it for. Basically, there are different kinds of ear prompters. You will see actually like newscast people. They'll have a little earpiece in their ear. You can have either a hardwire earpiece or you can have a wireless. The hardwire, it actually there's a little loop goes around and then it gets connected and people can talk to you back and forth. But for an ear prompter, what this is used for primarily is if you're giving a long talk. Let's say you are a spokesperson for a company at a convention and you're standing there in front of maybe hundreds of people and you're giving a 3-minute, 4-minute talk about a company. That's a lot of information, and you might be doing this, tons of times every day. You might do it, 3 times an hour, And yeah, having an ear prompter is really helpful. And I don't want to get into a whole ear prompter workshop here. I have done that, and actually you can find it on my website. But basically what you do is you record the entire script into a little either a micro cassette or a digital machine, and then you listen back to it. And by the way, so a wireless one, which is what I have, you have an earpiece, and then there's a loop that goes underneath your shirt, and it gets connected to whatever your recording device is. And yeah, I mean, you can listen to it. And once again, I don't want to get into techniques. There's certain techniques of how many words, you have to, well, actually, let me just tell you, I'm right here. Once you record it, you wait for the first 3 words to enter into your ear, then you start talking. If you try to begin talking as soon as the words pop into your head, it's going to throw you way off. So what I always do is I go 3, 2, 1 is silent, and then I start recording my line or my speech. And then when I hit the play button, I hear 3, 2, and then I wait for the first 3 words, then I start talking. So in those situations, ear prompters are great. I've seen like once or twice in my life, there's over 30 years in the business, where it was on an industrial film and somebody pulled out an ear prompter and started using it with dialogue with other actors. And I mean, she was pretty good at it. And what you would have to do is you actually have to record your lines, leave a space for the other actor's lines, and then your line comes back in. It can be very tricky timing-wise to make that happen. So, and you've got to have other actors who are very supportive and very nice, because if somebody speeds up a little bit, it's going to throw the ear prompter way off. So if you're doing a scene with other actors, it's really tough to use an ear prompter, and I would not recommend doing that. But like I said, it has been done, it can be done, but I would never use it for that purpose with any kind of dialogue with somebody else. I have only used it when either I am, giving a talk for a large group and it's a tremendous amount of material that I would just never be able to memorize, or if I'm an on-camera narrator for, let's say, a training film, and they can't use a teleprompter for some reason. I remember once doing something on a ship, and I was walking down the ship, and it was just way too narrow in order for them to even set up a teleprompter. So I used an ear prompter as I'm walking through there talking about a lot of technical stuff. Okay, so let me move on. This is from Allison. Have you ever had your lines memorized and then went blank on the set? Wow. I guess the reason for my hesitation and reaction to that is because, yes, one time it was one of the most embarrassing and most difficult jobs I ever had. It was on a TV show, and the crazy thing was I had one line. The one line, it was a weird line, and actually what's even crazier is I still remember that line. Normally, I do something, I forget all my lines. This one, the one that I struggled with, that one I remember. And it's not like I didn't practice. I mean, I had this thing down. It was easy. It was one line. Now, the words themselves were weird, and it just didn't seem like normal English. Still, I'm talking about like 10 words here. And right beforehand, and actually this was one of those times where I'm going over it and over it and over it right beforehand, and the guy sitting next to me in the scene has like 2 paragraphs, 2 or 3 paragraphs. It was a pretty good piece of thing, and then I just jump in. So I just jump in out of nowhere. It's not connected to any conversation. I'm just jumping in and adding something completely on my own, and I would get like 3 words done, and then all of a sudden I would just go blank. And then cut, okay, let's do it again. Now maybe I get 4 words down. I get stuck. And it probably took 5 takes for me to get the line. I mean, I got the line, but it felt horrible. And so, yeah, I mean, those things can happen. The crazy thing for me is the only time where I just went blank like that was when I had one line. And once again, and it was not part of the conversation. And I tell you, I read a book by Michael Caine, who's just a phenomenal actor. And he said he had the exact same experience early on in his career, where he had one line, popped in out of nowhere, wasn't part of a conversation, and he got stuck a bunch of times, and the director told him he would never work in the industry again. You know, the guy's probably done literally like 200 movies. And so you might remember he was the butler in Batman. That was probably one of the more recent things, but I mean, he's a very famous actor and great. So, yeah, I mean, look, we're human, you know, sometimes nerves take over, sometimes you're distracted. There are so many reasons why that can happen. But I do think that if you memorize things properly and you are prepared and you're able to relax yourself, not to say you're not going to make a mistake. I mean, we all make mistakes. But there's a difference between making a mistake and just getting completely stuck. And so, you know, hopefully you have people around you on the set who are also very supportive. You've got a director who understands that getting angry and screaming and yelling isn't going to help, and hopefully will do whatever he or she can to calm you down. So, yeah, I mean, that does happen. Knocking on wood, that never happens to me again because it was horrible. Okay, so let me move on to something hopefully a little bit nicer here from Alex. Is it better to also memorize the other actors' lines? You know, like, and, you know, people do things very differently. I kind of like the idea of not memorizing the other actors' lines, you know, that I'm the person I'm responding to. I'm going to be very familiar with them. Certainly I want to know cue lines. I want to know what they are saying. But once again, I like to be a little surprised. You know, even though I've read them a bunch of times, still when I hear them and I'm not hearing them in my head prior to him saying the lines or her saying the lines, I like that. So it's not a right or wrong. I mean, there are some people that memorize everybody's lines, you know, and it's up to you. I prefer not to memorize everybody else's lines, but just be very familiar with them and certainly know my cue line so I know when to pop in. I've got a couple other questions here. There's from Lauren. If you have your lines memorized for the audition, should you still have the sides in your hands? Yeah, and I tell you, I always like to have the sides in my hands, even if I have things memorized. So that way, just in case I get stuck someplace, I don't have to stop. I don't have to say, can I start over again? I don't have to start looking around in my pockets for the sides. Have them in your hand. And that way, even if you have them memorized and all of a sudden you get stuck, you just glance over and boom, you're right back into it. You didn't skip a beat. It looks very natural. And people understand. It's an audition. So you might not have had that much time to get things memorized anyway. And only once in my life did I have a casting director say, no, I don't want you to have the sides. And I just said to her, I said, you know, it's like a little security blanket for me. I'd really like to have them. And she didn't fight with me, and she was okay with it. And as it turns out, I didn't need to have it, but it was nice to have them in my hands. This is from Brooke. Does it matter if I just say the lines in my head, or do they need to be said out loud? Oh, okay. So I guess this means like when you're memorizing your lines, can you just say them in your head, hear them, you know, or is it better to say them out loud? Always say them out loud, without a doubt. It has a very different feel when you say them out loud. You want to get used to saying them out loud because that's the way it's going to be on the set. So, yeah, definitely say the words out loud. And here's the very last question before I wrap things up. This is from Jen. When I'm trying to memorize my lines, should I try and remember them the way I think they should be said at the audition or on the set? Oh, okay. So I think I understand what you're saying. So in other words, when you're memorizing the lines, should you be saying them with the same inflections, with the same attitude, with the same kind of character? You know, I think as you are beginning, just try to get the lines memorized. Don't worry about the character. You know, as you're getting closer to the shoot date, and now that you've spent some time, making some, decisions about the character, yeah, certainly then you can add some things in. Some people will say that they don't like to do any of that stuff and just show up on set and kind of do what they feel. I don't know. I'm not that courageous, and I don't have that much trust in myself that in that particular moment I know I'm going to hit exactly what I need to hit. So I would like to spend some time beforehand practicing how I want to do it, but I don't want to get locked into it either. I make sure that I give myself the freedom to be able to take new directions, be able to say lines in a different way, and from the director. And so, yeah, but at the very beginning, don't add anything to it. Just try to get your lines down. So those were all the questions. I loved putting this workshop together. I thought that some of the techniques and some of the strategies of, for memorizing lines were really interesting for me. Most of them I've used. Some of them are brand new. And I'm sure these are going to be really helpful to you as well. Just wanted to let you know real quickly, so next month there's going to be another great online workshop. You can still become a Season Pass member, and you can simply go to my website, howtomodel.com, and just click on the Season Pass, and it'll give you access to every single online workshop, all the bonuses as well. You'll save over 70% of the cost of all the videos that I've put together for you. I also offer online coaching, and you can just go to howtomodel.com/coaching. And I do one-on-one mentoring with people online. I set aside 5 days a month to do this, and depending on the program that you'd like to use, you can read all about it at howtomodel.com/coaching. And as always, look, if you have any questions at all, always feel free to follow up with me. You can go to facebook.com/howtomodel, and that's a great way to get in touch with me. You can also reach me through howtomodel.com, or you can also email me, and all my contact information is right here as well. So you'll be able to get all of the bonus materials as well, and also you'll also get a copy of this PowerPoint just so you can go through it slide by slide. I'm Aaron Marcus. This was a lot of fun, and can't wait to talk with you again soon.